She was born into a kingdom that did not believe in childhood. Before Christina Onassis ever understood the shape of her own name, it already belonged to ships, oil contracts, political negotiations, and a private island carved into myth. She entered the world as the only daughter of a man who moved presidents like chess pieces and measured affection in strategy. In the dynasty she inherited, love was rarely spontaneous. It was managed, timed, negotiated, like freight across an ocean. To the world, her birth completed an empire. To the empire, her birth secured continuity. But continuity is not the same as care. Christina was raised inside a fortune that could purchase anything except emotional safety. The Onassis name promised permanence, yet everything around her was unstable: marriages, loyalties, even the meaning of family itself. How does a child grow when she is never allowed to be small, only significant? And what happens when the price of inheritance is paid long before adulthood begins? Long before Christina Onassis learned to read her own surname, it had already become a structure larger than any single life. The Onassis dynasty did not begin with inheritance. It began with displacement. Aristotle Onassis was born in Smyrna, into a Greek family that lost everything in the fire and violence of the Greco-Turkish War. As a young man, he arrived in Argentina not as royalty, but as a refugee with ambition sharpened by humiliation. Loss was his first education. Survival was his first religion. From that foundation, he built an empire in shipping that defied governments and rewrote maritime law. He registered vessels under flags of convenience, negotiated oil contracts across hostile borders, and positioned himself between East and West during the Cold War. His fleet grew until it was not merely commercial, it was geopolitical. He did not simply transport cargo. He transported influence. Power, for Aristotle, was never decorative. It was defensive. It was insurance against ever being powerless again. But empires forged in insecurity often reproduce the very instability they are meant to defeat. By the time Christina was born in 1950, her father was no longer a displaced outsider. He was one of the richest men in the world. The Onassis fleet spanned oceans. Heads of state attended his gatherings. His yacht, Christina O., named after his daughter, became a floating palace where presidents, royalty, and film stars mingled under calculated hospitality. The world saw spectacle. Inside the family, spectacle replaced intimacy. Christina's mother, Athina Livanos, came from another powerful Greek shipping lineage. Their marriage united two maritime dynasties in what looked, from the outside, like a consolidation of elite bloodlines. But it was less a romance than an alliance. Aristotle was charismatic, brilliant, and emotionally impenetrable. Athina was young, raised within her own rigid elite structure, trained for presentation more than partnership. In this environment, marriage was strategic continuity, not sanctuary. Christina was born into a household where affection was secondary to appearance. Her father traveled constantly. Deals were negotiated in New York, London, Monte Carlo. The child saw him as a figure who arrived dramatically and departed just as quickly, bearing gifts, issuing instructions, radiating authority. He adored her publicly. He named his yacht after her. But symbolic gestures are not the same as presence. The Onassis home functioned less like a family and more like a private court. Staff outnumbered relatives. Conversations revolved around contracts, rivals, alliances. Silence was not emptiness, it was discipline. Emotions, when displayed, were either theatrical or suppressed. Christina's older brother, Alexander, occupied a different emotional position. As the male heir, he carried the implicit expectation of succession. Aristotle invested in him, not only financially, but symbolically. Alexander represented continuity of masculine command. Christina, though beloved in her father's way, was peripheral to the architecture of power. In dynasties, hierarchy begins in childhood. The imbalance was subtle but formative. Alexander accompanied their father more frequently, observed negotiations, absorbed the rhythms of maritime dominance. Christina watched. She learned early that proximity to power did not equal participation in it. Meanwhile, Aristotle's affairs were not hidden. They were part of the landscape. His relationship with opera singer Maria Callas unfolded publicly, destabilizing the family's internal order. Christina was still a child when the boundaries between marriage and betrayal dissolved into gossip headlines. Her mother's humiliation became visible. Divorce followed in 1960. The union that had fused two shipping empires fractured under ego, infidelity, and incompatibility. Christina, only 10 years old, experienced not simply a parental separation but a dynastic rupture. Custody arrangements were negotiated with the same calculation as business contracts. Children in ordinary families may witness arguments behind closed doors. Christina witnessed strategic repositioning. Her father soon married Jacqueline Kennedy, widow of an assassinated American president. The wedding in 1968 was not merely romantic, it was geopolitical theater. Aristotle secured proximity to American political legacy. Jacqueline secured financial protection and global reach. For Christina, the remarriage was displacement layered upon displacement. She was no longer simply the daughter of a magnate. She was now stepdaughter to a former first lady, a woman already mythologized. Media attention intensified. The family narrative expanded beyond Greece and shipping into the symbolic sphere of American tragedy and glamour. But proximity to myth rarely brings stability. Inside this expanding empire, Christina's emotional position grew more uncertain. Her mother remarried multiple times, seeking affection or escape. Her father remained dominant but distant, his attention fragmented between business and image management. Christina's adolescence unfolded inside contradiction. She had unlimited resources, yet limited emotional guidance. She had access to elite education, yet no consistent sense of belonging. The Onassis name opened every door except the one that leads to ordinary privacy. And then came the event that crystallized the family's underlying fragility. In 1973, Alexander Onassis died in a plane crash at the age of 24. The accident occurred during a landing attempt in Athens. He survived briefly, then succumbed to his injuries. For Aristotle, it was devastation beyond negotiation. The son who represented dynastic continuation was gone. The empire lost its intended successor. For Christina, it was more than grief. It was repositioning. Overnight, she became the sole surviving child within the Onassis bloodline. But this elevation was not celebratory. It was heavy. The unspoken hierarchy inverted. The daughter once peripheral to succession now stood at the center of it, not because she was prepared, but because no one else remained. In dynastic systems, death reorganizes destiny. Aristotle never fully recovered from Alexander's loss. Those close to him described a visible dimming. Within 2 years, in 1975, he too would die, weakened by illness and grief. Before his death, he established the Alexander S. Onassis Public Benefit Foundation, diverting a significant portion of his fortune into philanthropic structure. Christina inherited immense personal wealth, but also responsibility tied to legacy preservation. She was 25. At an age when most individuals are still forming identity, Christina inherited not simply money, but myth, obligation, and scrutiny. The Onassis empire, built from exile and ambition, now rested on a woman who had been emotionally conditioned for observation, not command. Her mother, Athina Livanos, had died in 1974 under circumstances shadowed by medication and overdose. Within 2 years, Christina lost her brother, her father, and her mother. 3 pillars gone. Inheritance arrived wrapped in absence. The Onassis dynasty, once anchored by a domineering patriarch and a designated male heir, was now embodied in a young woman shaped by instability. The environment that produced her had already normalized emotional distance, marital collapse, public spectacle, and strategic affection. Christina did not step into a stable throne. She stepped into a vacuum. And vacuums do not simply wait to be filled. They pull. The question was never whether she could manage the empire financially. Trustees, advisors, lawyers surrounded her. Systems were in place. The deeper question was psychological. What happens to a person raised in a dynasty where love was conditional, hierarchy rigid, and grief unresolved, when she becomes the final vessel of that dynasty's survival? By the time the world began to watch her as the richest young woman in Europe, the internal architecture of her life had already been shaped by patterns older than she was. Patterns of ambition without tenderness. Power without safety. Visibility without intimacy. Christina Onassis did not inherit a family. She inherited its unfinished trauma. Christina Onassis did not grow up inside a family. She grew up inside an expectation. By the time she reached adolescence, she had already learned the silent rules of her environment: never embarrass the name, never appear weak in public, never reveal fracture. The Onassis dynasty did not reward vulnerability. It rewarded composure. Her father's presence in her childhood had always been theatrical rather than intimate. Aristotle Onassis could command a boardroom, charm a head of state, outmaneuver competitors across continents. But emotional language was not part of his fluency. Affection arrived as gifts, gestures, access, not conversation. When he spoke to her, it was often as though speaking to a junior executive in training rather than a daughter still forming herself. He did not intend cruelty. He embodied hierarchy. Christina absorbed this dynamic early. Love was proximity. Proximity required performance. At school in Switzerland and later in France and England, she was surrounded by wealth, but not by normalcy. Classmates knew who she was. Teachers adjusted. Invitations were extended with calculation. Even in spaces meant to educate, she remained an emblem before she was a person. Privacy became choreography. The media, fascinated by the Onassis name, documented her weight fluctuations, her fashion choices, her rumored romances. Her body became public commentary before she had established a private sense of self. In elite circles, beauty was currency, discipline was expected. Christina's relationship with food, appearance, and control grew complicated in ways that were never fully addressed, only managed. There was always a sense that she was being evaluated, not as a young woman discovering identity, but as the sole surviving continuation of a financial monarchy. After her brother's death, this pressure intensified in subtle but decisive ways. Alexander had been groomed, intentionally or not, to inherit operational command. Christina had been peripheral to that design. When he died, the architecture did not change overnight to accommodate her development. Instead, she was repositioned inside an existing system built for someone else. No one paused to ask whether she wanted the role. The empire did not consult emotion. Her mother's instability offered no refuge. Athina Livanos, navigating her own loneliness after divorce, oscillated between attempts at reconstruction and emotional retreat. Christina witnessed fragility without guidance. She saw what happens when a woman in a powerful dynasty becomes disposable. Her mother had once embodied prestige, later, she became peripheral to Aristotle's narrative. Children study outcomes. Christina internalized a quiet fear that her worth, too, was conditional. When Aristotle married Jacqueline Kennedy, Christina's displacement sharpened. The new marriage was not merely romantic, it was symbolic. The Onassis dynasty fused with American political tragedy. Jacqueline's poise and public mystique created a new axis of attention. Christina was no longer the sole female figure orbiting her father's empire. Observers noted tension. Jacqueline, accustomed to image management, valued discipline and control. Christina, navigating grief and adolescence, oscillated between rebellion and compliance. Their relationship was formal, rarely warm. It did not have the ease of organic affection. In such environments, identity becomes reactive. Christina's early adulthood unfolded under the double weight of inheritance and comparison. She was scrutinized not only against societal standards but against the myth of her father's dominance and her stepmother's composure. Meanwhile, the emotional language of the family remained underdeveloped. After Alexander's death, grief within the Onassis circle was monumental but controlled. Aristotle mourned intensely, yet even sorrow carried authority. There were no family therapy sessions, no structured emotional reckoning. There were estates to manage, foundations to design, legal frameworks to secure. Christina learned that tragedy was to be endured, not processed. When her father died in 1975, she was 25, wealthy beyond imagination, yet psychologically unanchored. Advisors and trustees stepped in immediately. Lawyers explained structures. Accountants outlined assets. Philanthropic obligations were clarified. But no one explained how to exist without the gravitational force of a dominating patriarch. Her father had been distant, but he had been defining. His authority shaped her internal map. With him gone, she inherited not only wealth but the expectation to embody a stability she had never been taught to build internally. The public narrative framed her as the richest woman in Europe. Privately, she was a young woman whose formative years had been structured around performance, loss, and conditional affection. Her early marriages reflect this internal instability. Her first marriage, to American businessman Joseph Bolker, was brief and widely criticized. Observers questioned his motives, tabloids framed it as opportunistic. The union dissolved quickly. The pattern repeated with subsequent marriages, to shipping heir Alexandros Andreidis, to Russian civil servant Sergei Kozov. Each relationship carried the scent of negotiation. Prenuptial agreements were rigorous. Financial scrutiny was relentless. The world assumed that men pursued her fortune more than her companionship. Under such suspicion, intimacy becomes nearly impossible. When every suitor is evaluated for financial motive, emotional vulnerability feels reckless. Christina's relationships often oscillated between intense attachment and abrupt dissolution. It was not scandalous, it was patterned. She had grown up watching alliances formed for strategy rather than connection. Marriage, in her world, had rarely been sanctuary. It had been merger. The repetition suggests something deeper than poor judgment. It suggests emotional hunger shaped by early deprivation. A child who receives affection in symbolic gestures may spend adulthood chasing its tangible form, seeking in partners the reassurance never consistently granted in childhood. Yet each attempt reinforced the same outcome: disappointment, public scrutiny, further isolation. Her struggles with weight and health, often sensationalized, carried psychological undertones. Control over the body can become the only available control when environment feels unstable. Reports of medication use, medical interventions, and fluctuating self-image were widely circulated. But rarely did commentary ask the more relevant question: what does it do to a person to be observed since birth, evaluated against legacy, and deprived of ordinary invisibility? Christina's environment offered everything except anonymity. She could retreat to private islands, estates in France, apartments in Paris, yet nowhere was she unknown. Isolation within abundance is a particular form of confinement. The Onassis Foundation and corporate structures ensured financial security, but they also ensured constant engagement with legacy. Her father's portrait loomed symbolically over every board meeting, every philanthropic initiative. The name remained dominant. Christina, despite being its legal bearer, lived in its shadow. There was no blueprint for becoming simply herself. The tragedy of her childhood was not overt cruelty. It was structural conditioning. She was trained to preserve image before she formed identity. She was expected to inherit power before she understood attachment. She was surrounded by luxury before she developed emotional literacy. And so, by the time the world saw her as a glamorous heiress navigating yachts and European estates, the psychological architecture had already solidified. She had been shaped inside a dynasty that equated strength with silence. A family where grief reorganized hierarchy but never invited healing. A household where love was implied through provision, not articulated through presence. Christina Onassis did not collapse because she lacked opportunity. She was conditioned long before adulthood to equate worth with performance and security with control. When the world later interpreted her instability as excess or weakness, it overlooked the formative truth. She had never been allowed to be uncertain without consequence. And a child who grows up without safe uncertainty rarely becomes a stable adult. By her late 20s, Christina Onassis appeared to possess what dynasties are built to guarantee: authority, liquidity, autonomy. She controlled one of the largest personal fortunes in Europe. She presided over assets that stretched across continents. Advisors deferred to her signature. Governments welcomed her presence. Invitations flowed endlessly: Monaco, Paris, New York, Buenos Aires. From the outside, she had stepped fully into command. But control acquired without emotional foundation is architectural, not internal. Christina inherited systems designed by a man who trusted only leverage. Trustees managed the foundation. Legal frameworks protected capital. Corporate executives handled operations. She could approve, reject, reorganize. Yet the real axis of her life remained unstable: intimacy. Her marriages unfolded like negotiations disguised as romance. After her brief unions with Bolker, Andreades, and Kozov dissolved, each leaving behind tabloid speculation and financial settlement, a narrative solidified around her. She was portrayed as impulsive, searching, vulnerable to opportunists. The press framed her as the richest woman unable to secure loyalty. But this framing misunderstood the deeper pattern. Christina did not marry recklessly. She married urgently. Urgency often grows from deprivation. Each relationship seemed to carry the promise of stabilization: someone who would remain, who would not treat her as symbol or portfolio. Yet the conditions of her wealth made ordinary trust nearly impossible. Prenuptial agreements were exhaustive. Advisors investigated backgrounds. Motives were dissected before vows were spoken. When intimacy must pass through legal filtration, spontaneity dies quietly. Her fourth marriage, to French businessman Thierry Roussel in 1984, initially appeared different. Roussel came from established pharmaceutical wealth. He was composed, measured, accustomed to financial scale. For the first time, Christina married a man whose resources meant he did not need hers. The optics shifted. She gave birth to a daughter, Athena, in 1985. For a brief period, the narrative softened. Christina was no longer only heiress or wife, she was mother. The Onassis bloodline extended again. The dynasty, so often shadowed by death, felt momentarily renewed. Motherhood offered the illusion of reset. But illusions do not erase conditioning. Reports from those close to her suggest that Christina's happiness during this period was fragile, dependent on reassurance. She divided time between Europe and South America, balancing estates and corporate obligations with attempts at domestic stability. Yet the structural patterns of her upbringing re-emerged. Roussel's extramarital involvement with a longtime partner became increasingly visible. A parallel relationship existed alongside the marriage, known, tolerated, then impossible to ignore. Christina, who had grown up witnessing her father's affairs and her mother's displacement, found herself reenacting a familiar script. The dynasty repeated itself. Infidelity within powerful families is rarely spontaneous. It often mirrors a deeper emotional architecture: ambition over presence, image over intimacy, compartmentalization over confrontation. Christina had internalized from childhood that loyalty could fracture without warning. Now she experienced it not as observer, but participant. Publicly, she maintained composure. Privately, the erosion was evident. Her trust, already delicate, deteriorated. Advisors observed mood fluctuations. Friends noted exhaustion. Wealth insulated her from financial threat, but not from abandonment. The divorce from Roussel in 1987 was decisive. Custody battles and financial negotiations unfolded with precision. Christina ensured that her daughter's inheritance would be tightly structured, protected from dilution. Control reasserted itself through legal reinforcement. But the question lingered beneath the transactions: what does control compensate for? Throughout these years, Christina invested heavily in property, estates in France, apartments in Paris, residences in Argentina. Physical space expanded as emotional security contracted. Houses multiplied. Staff rotated. Yet she often appeared alone within vast interiors. Luxury can function as insulation. It can also function as echo chamber. Observers frequently commented on her fluctuating health. Reports of medication, exhaustion, attempts at weight management, and physical discomfort circulated persistently. Medical consultations were common. Rest periods were recommended. Retreats were attempted. But environment matters more than prescription. Christina had never experienced sustained emotional stability. Her father's dominance, her mother's fragility, her brother's death, her stepmother's formal distance, repeated marital fractures, these were not isolated incidents. They formed a consistent narrative: connection is temporary, security is performative. By her mid-30s, she had everything her dynasty valued: wealth preserved, legacy extended through her daughter, assets intact. Yet internally, there was fatigue. Those who encountered her during later years described a woman alternately charming and withdrawn. She could host lavish gatherings, then retreat abruptly. She could negotiate financial matters with clarity, then fall into silence when conversations turned personal. The public still perceived her as an emblem of old-world opulence. Photographs captured yachts, tailored dresses, international travel. But glamour often functions as camouflage. The deeper instability was not visible in headlines. It was cumulative: the slow erosion of trust, the constant negotiation between image and vulnerability, the exhaustion of performing resilience. There was, during this period, a potential turning point. After her daughter's birth and before the collapse of her marriage to Roussel, Christina briefly reduced public engagements. She considered restructuring her life around a smaller circle, focusing on motherhood, limiting media exposure, narrowing corporate involvement. It was the closest she came to stepping away from the gravitational pull of her surname. But stepping away from a dynasty requires psychological permission. Christina had been conditioned to preserve continuity. Her father's legacy loomed as both burden and anchor. The Alexander Onassis Foundation, the estates, the fleet, these were not optional attachments. They were the framework of her existence. To withdraw fully would have meant redefining herself outside the Onassis architecture. And she had never been taught how to exist without it. So the illusion of control persisted. She managed assets. She structured trusts for her daughter. She traveled strategically. She adjusted visibility. Externally, nothing appeared chaotic. Internally, exhaustion deepened. The tragedy was not dramatic implosion. It was quiet depletion. Christina Onassis seemed powerful because she could sign documents that moved millions. But power over assets does not equal power over emotional inheritance. The environment that shaped her, strategic affection, conditional loyalty, hierarchical love, remained active within her psyche. By the late 1980s, the world saw a wealthy divorcee, occasionally reclusive, navigating elite society. What it did not see was the accumulated weight of a life structured around survival rather than safety. Control had always been her dynasty's language. But control cannot generate intimacy. And without intimacy, even empires feel unstable. The missed exit was approaching, subtle, almost invisible, disguised not as catastrophe, but as choice. The moment when Christina Onassis might have altered the trajectory of her life did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived quietly, disguised as a narrowing. By 1987, after the collapse of her fourth marriage, she stood at a rare crossroads. She was no longer tethered to a husband whose loyalties were divided. Her daughter, Athena, was still young enough to shape a different environment. The empire was financially secure. Trustees were established. The foundation operated independently. For the first time, structural obligations did not require constant public performance. She could have withdrawn. Not as an heiress retreating in scandal, but as a mother redefining scale. She owned private islands, estates in Europe, residences in South America. She possessed the resources to create a smaller, quieter life beyond relentless scrutiny. She had already begun reducing appearances, limiting interviews, declining invitations. The possibility existed. But possibility requires internal permission. Christina had spent her entire life inside systems where retreat signaled weakness. In her father's world, dominance was survival. In her mother's world, fragility led to displacement. In her own marriages, emotional exposure led to humiliation. Withdrawal felt dangerous. To step away from the Onassis axis would not simply change geography. It would require reimagining identity without constant reference to legacy. An identity, for her, had always been relational: daughter of Aristotle, sister of Alexander, stepdaughter of Jacqueline Kennedy, wife of prominent men, mother of the last Onassis heir. She had never been simply Christina. After her divorce from Thierry Roussel, custody negotiations intensified her protective instincts. She structured Athena's inheritance with precision, insulating assets from paternal influence. Trust mechanisms were reinforced. Legal boundaries tightened. She was determined that her daughter would not grow up vulnerable to financial manipulation. Yet the paradox remained: she could protect money more easily than she could transmit emotional safety. Friends and associates described her during this period as contemplative, at times hopeful. She spoke about simplifying her surroundings, focusing on motherhood, perhaps spending more time in Argentina, a country she had come to appreciate for its distance from European scrutiny. Argentina represented something close to anonymity. The Onassis name carried less daily weight there. She could move with fewer cameras, fewer assumptions. This was the narrow opening. A relocation not merely of residence, but of narrative. But psychological conditioning does not dissolve with intention. Even in Argentina, the structures followed her. Advisors visited. Communications flowed from Europe. Corporate decisions required input. The foundation's symbolic gravity remained constant. She was still the living embodiment of a maritime dynasty forged in exile and ambition. And internally, patterns resurfaced. Her health concerns persisted. Reports indicated chronic fatigue, medication adjustments, medical consultations. Emotional resilience, already eroded by repeated relational fractures, seemed thin. There were moments of warmth, particularly around her daughter, but they coexisted with visible strain. To truly exit the dynastic script would have required confronting the original architecture: her father's emotional distance, her mother's instability, her brother's death, the internalized belief that love is temporary and performance essential. That confrontation never fully occurred. Instead, Christina continued to oscillate between attempts at stabilization and subtle retreat. She reduced public presence but did not redefine purpose. She guarded her daughter fiercely but did not rebuild her own sense of safety. She moved physically but remained psychologically inside the same framework. The missed exit was not a single decision declined. It was a series of smaller ones, moments when she might have chosen therapy over image management, vulnerability over composure, restructuring identity over preserving dynasty. But vulnerability had never been modeled as strength in her world. In 1988, she traveled again to Argentina. It was not a dramatic journey. It was routine, almost ordinary. She was 37 years old, younger than her father had been when his empire began to solidify globally. On the surface, there was no visible crisis. No scandal erupted. No financial collapse threatened her. No public breakdown unfolded. The danger was not explosive. It was cumulative. Years of emotional depletion, relational instability, and internalized pressure had narrowed her reserves. The same environment that had taught her to endure without complaint had also taught her to suppress warning signs. In November 1988, Christina Onassis was found dead in her residence in Buenos Aires. The official cause was reported as heart failure, associated with pulmonary edema. There were references to medication, to long-term health complications. The language was clinical. She died quietly. No dramatic final act. No public unraveling. No catastrophic financial loss. The exit she had almost taken, the smaller life, the redefined scale, had never fully materialized. Instead, she remained partially inside the architecture that had shaped her, even as she attempted to soften its edges. Her death completed a pattern. Her brother had died at 24. Her father at 69. Her mother at 45. Christina at 37. The dynasty that promised permanence seemed unable to preserve its own heirs. The missed exit was not about geography. It was about permission to exist outside inherited expectations. And permission, for Christina Onassis, was a language she had never been taught to speak. Christina Onassis did not collapse in public. There was no spectacle to satisfy the appetite that had followed her since adolescence. No bankruptcy. No televised confrontation. No confession. What occurred instead was erosion, gradual, disciplined, almost obedient. In the months before her death, those who encountered her often described a familiar duality. She could be articulate, even charming, when discussing business matters. She remained capable of sharp financial reasoning. Contracts were reviewed. Advisors were consulted. Structures were maintained. The machinery of wealth functioned flawlessly. But when conversation drifted away from logistics and toward the personal, something receded. Silence lengthened. Energy dimmed. She seemed tired in a way that sleep does not repair. Exhaustion, in dynastic families, is rarely acknowledged as a warning. It is treated as an inconvenience. Christina had been raised in an environment where endurance was currency. Her father endured exile, risk, and competition. Her mother endured humiliation and displacement. Her brother endured expectation until death interrupted him. She, too, endured, marriages dissolving, media scrutiny persisting, legacy pressing constantly against her autonomy. Endurance had replaced reflection. By the late 1980s, she was no longer trying to prove herself socially. The glamorous appearances had diminished. The marriages had ended. The narrative of romantic rescue had exhausted itself. What remained was routine. Routine in large estates. Routine with medical consultations. Routine with structured phone calls across continents. Routine with a daughter she loved fiercely, yet perhaps feared failing. There is a particular solitude that accompanies immense wealth. It does not stem from lack of company. Staff are present. Advisors are accessible. Invitations continue. The solitude emerges from uncertainty about motive. Christina had lived long enough to recognize how often affection gravitated toward her fortune. Even sincere gestures were filtered through suspicion. Trust requires surrender, surrender requires safety. Safety, in her experience, had always been temporary. Her body became another contested territory. Reports from physicians over the years referenced chronic conditions, fluctuating weight, medication adjustments. Some speculated about long-term pharmaceutical use for anxiety or sleep. None of these details were extraordinary in isolation. What was extraordinary was the cumulative burden. A nervous system conditioned by instability does not easily regulate itself. A child who learned that connection disappears may remain hyperalert in adulthood. Even in silence, the body carries memory. By 1988, Christina's life had narrowed to a series of controlled environments, residences carefully managed, movements discreet, communication structured. She was not hiding. She was contained. The dynasty she embodied had been built to conquer oceans. Yet its last direct heir lived increasingly within interior spaces. There is a quiet violence in being reduced to symbol. Christina was perpetually described as the richest woman in Europe, the last Onassis, the heiress. Rarely was she described simply as a person navigating unresolved grief. Grief, for her, was layered. The loss of her brother had transformed her position within the family. The loss of her father had removed both authority and anchor. The loss of her mother had eliminated any remaining maternal refuge. The loss of trust in marriage had confirmed that intimacy, for her, was unstable. Each loss was absorbed without structured healing. In November 1988, in Buenos Aires, she was found lifeless in her residence. The official explanation, heart failure linked to pulmonary complications, was delivered without dramatic framing. There were references to medication, to pre-existing health issues. It was not the type of death that invites conspiracy on a grand scale. It was the type that concludes exhaustion. 37 years old. An age at which many lives are just stabilizing. Her daughter was 3. The Onassis fortune did not disappear. Trusts activated. Foundations continued. Legal guardianship transferred to Thierry Roussel. The dynasty's financial architecture proved resilient. But the human architecture had already collapsed. There is something stark about a life surrounded by abundance ending in quiet isolation. Christina did not lose everything in scandal. She did not descend publicly into chaos. She faded within structures designed to preserve her. And perhaps that is the deeper tragedy. She had been conditioned to endure pressure, to maintain composure, to equate survival with silence. In doing so, she learned to suppress signals that might have demanded intervention. Her collapse did not break headlines with violence. It left a child, a fortune, and a surname once again without its immediate bearer. The Onassis empire, forged in exile and fortified by ambition, had lost another heir not to financial ruin, but to internal depletion. Christina's life did not implode. It thinned. And thinning, when unnoticed, can be fatal. Empires measure success in longevity. Families measure survival in heirs. By those standards, the Onassis dynasty endured. Ships still sailed under corporate management. The Alexander S. Onassis Foundation continued its philanthropic work. Trusts activated precisely as designed. Wealth transferred seamlessly to the next generation. The system held. But systems are not the same as people. What remains of Christina Onassis is not the scale of her fortune. It is the pattern her life traced, a pattern of inheritance without insulation, visibility without safety, intimacy without trust. She was born into a name that promised permanence, yet nearly every emotional structure around her proved temporary. Father, mother, brother, husbands, each connection either fractured or vanished. The dynasty she preserved financially could not preserve her psychologically. Her story lingers not because it is scandalous, but because it feels inevitable. A child raised where love was strategic learns to negotiate affection. A daughter shaped by dominance mistakes endurance for strength. An heiress conditioned to maintain image forgets how to ask for protection. Christina Onassis did not fail her empire. She fulfilled it. And in doing so, she revealed the quiet cost of being born into a system that secures everything, except the right to be emotionally unguarded.